India announces the first of its kind infrastructure and connectivity pact with West Asia and Europe at the G20 Summit, says the soon-to-be launched India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor aims for stronger trade ties and energy flow from the Gulf to Europe via railways and ports linked to India. India makes a clean energy push. G20 announces a global biofuel alliance with India, the US and Brazil as founding members, invites G20 nations and others to join the group. G20 set to become G21 as the African Union is included as a permanent member of the grouping months after New Delhi's recommendation. Prime Minister Modi hails the inclusion, says trust and reliance should now replace global trust deficit. And central Morocco brought to its knees after a massive earthquake kills more than 2,000 people and leaves at least 1,500 injured. Rescue operations underway to evacuate several victims trapped in remote villages. Hello and welcome to this special G20 programming on CNBC-TV18. I am Ritu Singh. Now let's get you a first post exclusive to begin with. Our colleague Palki Sharma spoke to Brazilian President Lula on the sidelines of the G20 Summit. Now he hailed the Delhi Declaration while maintaining that the G20 Summit is not the right forum to discuss the Ukraine war. Take a look.
I think it was an extraordinary, the India agenda that they developed and the promotion of 60 debates or more in different cities. In Brazil, many ministers came to these meetings. We had the health minister, we had the mines and energy minister from Brazil, we had the science and technology minister, the enormous amount, the labor minister came here, and the finance minister came to these meetings. So these hundreds of meetings that you involving thousands of people is a new way that India is teaching to us that it's not sufficient for the presidents of the countries to participate. It's necessary for us to involve the government as a whole, and that we should involve the people that should participate in the debate. We learned a lot, and since we're going to host next year the G20 in Brazil, we will take from India many teachings, and so that we can have a G20 meeting as productive as we had here in India.
One of the big headlines today is the Delhi Declaration. We understand that there is finally consensus. We've seen the draft of the declaration and all leaders have agreed. There was a fear that the war in Ukraine might hijack the agenda. And in the statements that followed since, it was said that Brazil, South Africa and Indonesia helped forge consensus. Can you tell us a little more about the conversation that went in and how did Brazil contribute?
Well, the G20 is a forum that was built because of the 2008 and 2009 global financial crisis. From there onwards, the G20 started to discuss many economic issues, and the Bretton Woods institutions were also started to be discussed, the World Bank, the IMF, in an attempt to try to improve the functioning of these multilateral institute. That's why we didn't want here in India, we would discuss the war between Ukraine and Russia. This is not the appropriate forum for that. On the 19th of September of this month, we will have the General Assembly of the UN, and that's the place for us to discuss the war. That's the place for us to try to discuss peace. That's the place for us to call Putin and Zelensky in a negotiation table, and because no one wants war, everybody is against war, we want peace. So it's necessary for us to establish a conversation policy so that we can try to convince the two presidents for Russia and Ukraine that the war is not the solution for anything, and that the dialogue, the diplomacy, and a table of dialogue could help much more. From the beginning, Brazil has been saying that we do not want to participate in the war efforts. Brazil wants to participate in the peace effort. We want to try to negotiate, as also India thinks like that, China thinks like that, many other countries think like Brazil, and so that's why we believe that it's very important so that the war issue should not be included in the document document in the declaration from the G20. That's very important. Otherwise, people go to war and then we lose and waste time instead of discussing the problems that involve 9 billion inhabitants, the hunger that is affecting 735 million people, unemployment of millions of people, and we stay here discussing something that is not our top priority. And so I believe that it was very important, the decision that was made not to allow that the war would come into our declaration.
We saw an expansion of the BRICS. There was a report, or many reports, that said that China wants to create an anti-Western bloc. That's the direction that it was taking. I understand that some countries were not on board with that idea. You endorsed the idea of a BRICS common currency to take on or to replace the US dollar. Are you happy with the direction that this grouping is taking?
Well, first of all, I did not endorse of a common currency. Brazil proposed the idea for a long time for a need of the countries to build currencies so that they don't need the dollar. I can negotiate with India with my own currency and India with their currency. The same thing, my currency with the China's their own currency. The Europeans created the euro. Why can't we create a new currency for trade? But we'll keep our own national currencies. What we did was to allow that the finance ministers of the BRICS countries have 1 year to find a solution for this new currency. And we do not want to confront anybody with this idea. We don't want to go against the G7, because I'm also a guest at the G7. I participate in the G20, in the BRICS meetings. I participate in the IPSA, which is a group, India, Brazil, and South Africa forum, that China does not participate in the IPSA. And so we have to have the awareness that no one wants to create a bloc against another bloc. What we want is to be treated with respect and under equal terms. This is what we want, only that. And India has the right to be not only a big country in terms of population, but a great country in terms of the quality of lives of their people, of its people. Brazil too has that right. China too. The US too. All of us dream that our people will reach the welfare state that Europe has achieved. We dream with a welfare state, and we know for that this is a very difficult task to reach that welfare state, because we have to find more ores, more richness in nature. And I don't know if nature has all that wealth for us to find. We cannot live in a world possibly where 2% of humanity has much more wealth than 50% of the poor.
Well, that's the president of Brazil, which is set to take over the G20 or G21 presidency next from India. But let us get you some of the key highlights from day one. Now, a big breakthrough at the G20 Summit. We have a joint statement and the New Delhi Declaration, which has been adopted. This comes as a significant victory for India's G20 presidency amid increasing tensions and divergent views over the Ukraine conflict. In fact, India's G20 Sherpa, Amitabh Kant, said that there was 100% consensus from all countries on all 83 paragraphs in the declaration. However, while the statement makes a mention of the war in Ukraine, it leaves out any direct mention of Russian aggression. Artificial intelligence also found a mention for the very first time in this year's declaration. The advancement of AI holds a promise of fostering global economic prosperity and growth. The leaders have committed to pursue a pro-innovation regulatory approach. India has also made a push for clean energy at G20 with an aim to help accelerate global efforts to meet net zero emission targets. It announced a global biofuels alliance with India, USA and Brazil as founding members. India has also invited G20 nations and others to join the group. Finally, Modi also invited the head of the African Union to take his seat as a permanent member of the G20 as the first session of the summit began.
While noting that the G20 is not the platform to resolve geopolitical and security issues, the leaders recognized that they can have significant consequences for the global economy. In particular, They dwelt on the ongoing war in Ukraine and the impact it has had, especially on developing and least developing nations still recovering from the pandemic and economic disruption. The three F's, food, fuel, and fertilizers, were issues of special concern.
All countries have unanimously supported the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration. This is one declaration without a single footnote and without any chair's summary. This is a complete statement with 100% unanimity. This demonstrates both the Prime Minister's and India's great ability to bring all developing countries, all emerging markets, all developed countries, China, Russia, everybody together on the same table and bring consensus.
The global push for clearer policies on crypto assets has gained momentum under the Indian presidency, and a global consensus is emerging on the same. The presidency will support the IMF and the FSB, and FSB is also setting the contours of the regulatory framework for a globally coordinated approach to crypto assets. So the presidency, with the support of IMF and the FSB, is setting these contours. The roadmap estimates that implementation of the CAF and the measures thereby will potentially yield additional lending headroom of approximately $200 billion over the next decade.
Well, it's time for a short break in the show, but as we do that, let us get you visuals from this morning where G20 leaders paid homage to Mahatma Gandhi in New Delhi's Rajghat.
मैं राष्ट्रपति लूला को इस अवसर पर अपने विचार साझा करने के लिए आमंत्रित करता हूं.
Bem, primeiro, gostaria de dizer às autoridades aqui presentes, suas altezas, aos presidentes, aos primeiros ministros, de que a natureza ela continua dando demonstração de que nós precisamos cuidar dela com muito mais carinho. Essa semana, há 3 dias atrás, no Brasil, um ciclone no estado do Rio Grande do Sul. Nunca tinha havido ciclone, matou 46 pessoas e tem quase 50 pessoas desaparecidas. Isso nos chama a atenção.
But the cyclone killed 46 people, and we have almost 50 people missing. And this draws our attention because phenomena such as these have been taking place in all different locations on our planet. Well, first I would like to congratulate Prime Minister Narendra Modi for the efficient leading of the Indian presidency of the G20 and for the excellent work done in preparing this summit, and also with all the care that he and they gave us in these days that we spent with you. I thank India for its efforts to give voice, for giving voice to the topics of interest to emerging economies. So I would also like to give my salute to our friend, the representative of the African Union, who is a member of G20.
Como uma das principais instâncias de governança global na esteira de uma crise que abalou a economia mundial. Nossa atuação conjunta nos permitiu enfrentar os momentos mais críticos, mas foi insuficiente para corrigir.
And this was not sufficient to correct the structural defects of neoliberalism. The global financial architecture has changed little, and the foundations of a new economic governance have not been laid. New emergencies emerged. Challenges have accumulated and worsened. We are living in a world where wealth is more concentrated, in which millions of human beings still go hungry, where sustainable development is always threatened, in which governance institutions still reflect the reality of the middle of the last century. We will only be able to face all these problems if we address the issue of inequality of income, access to health care, education, food, gender, and race, and also of representation is at the origin of all these anomalies. If we want to make a difference, we have to place reducing inequalities at the core of the international agenda. Therefore, the Brazilian presidency of the G20 has 3 priorities. The first one is social inclusion and fight against hunger, energy transition, and sustainable development in its 3 aspects: the vector social, the economic, and environmental vector. And thirdly, the reform of global governance institutions. All these priorities are part of the Brazilian presidency motto, which says, building a fair world and a sustainable planet. 2 task forces will be created: the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty and the Global Mobilization Against Climate Change. We need to redouble our efforts to achieve the goal of ending world hunger by 2030. Otherwise, we will be facing the biggest multilateral failure in recent years. Acting to fight climate change requires political will and determination from the rulers, as well as resources and technology transfer. We want greater participation of the emerging countries in the decision-making process of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The unbearable foreign debt of the poorest countries needs to be addressed. The WTO must be revitalized and its dispute settlement system must start working again. To regain its political strength, the UN Security Council needs to count on the presence of new developing countries among its permanent and non-permanent members. The international community looks at us with hope because we bring together economies from emerging countries and developed countries in the G20. We represent 80% of the global GDP, 75% of exports, and around 60% of the world's population. To ensure that the G20 acts in an inclusive and coherent manner, Brazil intends to organize work around three general guidelines. First, we will make the political and financial paths work in coordination and in a more integrated way. There's no point in agreeing on the best public policy if we do not allocate the necessary resources for its implementation. Second, we have to listen to civil society. There are no governments without civil society. The Brazilian presidency will ensure that engagement groups have the opportunity to report their conclusions and recommendations to government representatives. Thirdly, we cannot let geopolitical issues hijack the discussion agenda of the various G20 levels. We are not interested in a divided G20. Only through joint action may we face the challenges of our days. We need peace and cooperation instead of conflict. The path that will take us from New Delhi to Rio de Janeiro will require a lot of dedication and commitment from everyone. The technical groups and the preparatory ministerial meetings will be hosted in several cities in all our 5 regions of our country. For that reason, we will welcome the members of the G20 with open arms. And we need effectively the support of all the people here, including the track record of this successful summit meeting that was hosted by our dear country that is India. I will be very much honored to welcome you all to the Rio de Janeiro summit in November of 2024. And before I hand the hammer here, I would like to thank very much to Prime Minister Modi and to thank to the Indian people for the competence that they had for organizing this event. And I would like to say, Prime Minister Modi, that I personally am very much touched emotionally when I want to pay a homage to our dear Gandhi, that we paid a homage today. Everybody knows that in my political life, Mahatma Gandhi has great meaning because the struggle with nonviolence was a role model that I followed for many decades when I was in the labor movement. And that's why I'm very much touched and emotional and I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to pay this homage that we did today. And I'd like to say to all of you that Brazil will take the chair of the G20 and we will make a tremendous endeavor to manage to at least try to do something as the same that our brothers and sisters from India did. Thank you very much.
Your Highnesses, Excellencies, जैसा आप सब जानते हैं, भारत के पास नवंबर तक G20 प्रेसिडेंसी की भी जिम्मेदारी है। अभी 2.5 महीने बाकी हैं। इन 2 दिनों में आप सभी ने अनेक बातें यहां रखी हैं, सुझाव दिए हैं, बहुत सारे प्रस्ताव रखे हैं। हमारी ये जिम्मेदारी है कि जो सुझाव आए हैं उनको भी एक बार फिर देखा जाए कि उनकी प्रगति में गति कैसे लाई जा सकती है। मेरा प्रस्ताव है कि हम नवंबर के अंत में G20 का एक वर्चुअल सेशन और रखें। उस सेशन में हम इस समिट के दौरान तय विषयों की समीक्षा कर सकते हैं। इन सब की डिटेल्स हमारी टीम आप सभी के साथ शेयर करेगी। मैं उम्मीद करता हूं कि आप सब इससे जुड़ेंगे। योर हाइनेसेस, एक्सेलेंसीज, इसी के साथ मैं G20 समिट के समापन की घोषणा करता हूं। वन अर्थ, वन फैमिली, वन फ्यूचर का रोड मैप सुखद हो। स्वस्ति अस्तु विश्वस्य, यानी संपूर्ण विश्व में आशा और शांति का संचार हो। 140 करोड़ भारतीयों की इसी मंगल कामना के साथ आप सभी का बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
Okay, so that was, Prime Minister Modi handing over the G20 presidency to Brazil. Although, remember, India does have the presidency until November. The G20 Summit has officially been declared closed. We heard from the Brazil president as well about the priorities, about cooperation, fighting hunger, fighting poverty, climate finance, and he stressed on the need for global collaboration because he said even with the best policies in place, unless you have the political will, unless you have the necessary resources, it'll be impossible to implement them. And there, the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, also proposing a virtual session before India officially hands over the presidency to Brazil. Okay, on that note, we're going to take a short break, but don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with our special coverage of the G20 Summit. Welcome back to our special programming of the G20 Summit. Now here's some more announcements that were made on the first day. India, West Asia and Europe are set to launch the first of its kind trade and connectivity pact, the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. US President Joe Biden called the announcement of the corridor a big deal. Prime Minister Narendra Modi called the pact, which had been in works for some time, a historic infrastructure deal that brings together 3 continents.
आज हम सब ने एक महत्वपूर्ण और ऐतिहासिक समझौता संपन्न होते हुए देखा है। आने वाले समय में यह भारत, पश्चिम एशिया और यूरोप के बीच इकोनॉमिक इंटीग्रेशन का प्रभावी माध्यम होगा। यह पूरे विश्व में कनेक्टिविटी और विकास को सस्टेनेबल दिशा प्रदान करेगा।
As a key part of this corridor, we're going to invest in ships and rail that extends from India all the way to Europe, connected by the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel. We're going to invest in a new rail line that will extend from the western port in Angola to the DRC, to Zambia, and ultimately the Indian Ocean. This is a game-changing regional investment, and both of these are huge steps forward.
The India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. This is nothing but historic. It will be the most direct connection to date between India, the Arabian Gulf, and Europe, with a rail link that will make trade between India and Europe 40% faster. This corridor is much more than just a railway or a cable. It is a green and digital bridge across continents and civilizations.
Well, on the sidelines of the G20 Summit, CNBC-TV18 also spoke to Petroleum Minister Hardeep Singh Puri about the Global Biofuel Alliance, which was announced by Prime Minister Narendra Modi yesterday. The minister told CNBC-TV18 that the alliance is a big step forward in bringing consumers and producers on a single platform. Listen in.
The Global Biofuels Alliance is very special because it brings countries together, those who are producers of biofuels, those who are consumers, those who are interested in international standards and specifications, technical issues. Today, against a target of 10% by November 2022, you did it 5 months in advance. You did 10%. Today you have a target of 20% biofuels blending for 2030. You're going to do it by 2025.
How will this drive the agenda of greater adoption of biofuels across the world, ethanol blended fuel? How do you think this will drive the agenda? What will be the pillars of this alliance going forward?
Well, I think the answer is very simple. The answer actually comes from the fact that you make an assessment what is the nature of the biofuels market today. According to the IEA, the International Energy Association, the biofuels market today is about $92 billion, less than $100 billion. But it is expected by 2030 to go up to $192 billion. So, I mean, kaha $92 billion and kaha $192 billion.
Well, World Bank Chief Ajay Banga hails the New Delhi declaration adopted by the G20. He told CNBC-TV18 that the private sector needs to play a bigger role to develop sustainable quality infrastructure.
We've got a New Delhi declaration. There were question marks on whether one would come through or not. Your first takeaway from this experience?
My first take is just the fact that that declaration did come through. You saw the articles and the burst of sort of cynicism around it. I actually think the Indian government managed to get and corral everybody to the right place. So I think it's actually a bit of a well done by the team, by Amitabh, the Sherpa, but of course by the External Affairs and the PM himself.
In terms of the bank itself, the revision of the capital adequacy framework and what room or headroom that opens up for you, let's talk specifically about the headroom for the bank and then the private sector participation and the leverage that you hope that will be able to fund some of these issues that we spoke of.
So just the loan to equity ratio creates about $50 billion of additional lending over the course of the decade. the announcements that are coming out right now, what the US government has put into the request to Congress, creates another 25 billion over the decade. Germany announced some things today. Others are in the pipeline. By the time our annual meeting happens in Marrakesh, we're thinking that all this put together could get us to between 100 and 150 billion dollars of lending. Now, keep in mind, we do about 120 billion of committed lending every year. So this is important, but it's not going to change the world.
Yeah, it's incremental. It
is incremental, and that's the idea. The idea is to sweat the balance sheet and make it work harder. But there's things you can do. If you originate to distribute in our IFC, then you can leverage the balance sheet over many times again. That work is internal and is beginning as we speak. Then there'll be the issue as we go along. I call this the better bank. If I do what I need to do with the mission and vision, if I do what I need to do with capital adequacy framework, I do what I need to do with how the bank works, then the question is, should we go for a bigger bank? Because then the question that faces the richer world is, what's the limit of your ambition on how you want to drive change in the developing world? And I think you should expect that to be the next conversation at some point of time. A little bit down the road, once we've got this bigger bank idea ready based on having a better bank in the bag. That's where I'm going.
So the journey from bigger to better, or better to bigger, or better to bigger, what is the aspiration? And I know that this is a work in progress and a work in process, but what is the aspiration given the needs that the world faces today?
Well, the G20 expert group put out aspirations. They talked in terms of hundreds of billions of dollars of additional capital into the multilateral banks. I don't know if that's going to come, because it's not as though the world has got a great deal of fiscal headroom right now to be able to do this. Would this change in a year or two? It could. So I don't know. My approach to the N.K. Singh, Larry Summers report is to take it in, understand it, and say, let's get the better bank going. Let's create the room and headroom for asking for the bigger bank, which is what I'm doing. But meanwhile, let's get going with the private sector. Because, Shirin, even if we get 100 billion more capital, you're not going to get what you need for the kind of things we're discussing, from renewable energy to agriculture and methane to transportation to what we need to do with carbon capture. This is just in the climate space. Now let's talk poverty alleviation. Then let's talk pandemics, and then let's talk fragility and refugees. So there's a lot to be done here. The idea that somehow this will all come from multilateral banks or the generosity of the richer world, I don't think you should do that. I think you should view that as seed capital, as the foundation on which the private sector must come.
That's Ajay Banga in conversation with CNBC-TV18, who's recently taken over as the chief of the World Bank. We will continue our coverage of the G20 after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We're back in just a moment. G20 coverage, and let us get you another CNBC TV18 exclusive on the sidelines of the G20 Summit. Chair of B20 Africa Council and Bharti Enterprises founder Sunil Mittal calls the inclusion of the African Union in the grouping a defining moment. Speaking to Shireen Bhan, he made the case for a reset of Africa's debt and said Bharti Airtel remains bullish on Africa. Listen into a slice of that conversation.
Today's inclusion of African Union as a permanent member of G20, which today has become one of the most important bodies globally, signals that you cannot leave large continents like Africa behind. Even countries like Zambia, which are having tremendous amount of deposits of copper and were doing reasonably well, have fallen into huge debt traps. Countries which are oil-producing countries like Angola, Gabon, and many others are also in huge debt. And this needs a reset. To my mind, a debate must ensue amongst the global leaders how to write off most of these loans once and reset Africa into the next order. By giving large amounts of debt, for example, from China, and then securing long-term supply chains on critical minerals and metals, oil and gas, Africa has been deprived of continuous income that is required to build their own infrastructure, healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Well, we remain very bullish on Africa, African growth. I mean, Africa has been growing for Airtel at 20% every year in constant currency, which is absolutely stunning growth for a company that you can double in about 4 years' time your total revenue. The only problem in Africa has been currency depreciation. So in terms of currency depreciation, it's a matter of great worry. And as the economies of Africa will stabilize, so would the currencies. With the US, India coming together, I think this particular symbiotic relationship will force, to my mind, the direction of the future of telecom technologies away from some of the existing powerful countries like China, who had taken a big lead in the 4G and 5G space. Under the IRA, what changes is serious, large investments, multi-billion dollars of investment, tens of billions of investments into semiconductor manufacturing, into various other technology manufacturing platforms, which require very large amounts of money. Today, US under the IRA give very large amounts of money to companies to set up those shops in the US, which deprives countries like India to draw those large dollars here. If we become a part of under the IRA as an ally of US, under the IRA part, then of course these companies can be encouraged to bring their investments into India as if they were setting up in the US. That is what Japan has got, you see, and that's what India, I hope, can get in the coming years. Launch a week should be our ambition, 52 launches a year of rockets, hopefully one day reusable rockets like SpaceX. We should start to do more activities on the moon and Mars and other planets, and possibly be a part of the space station in a bigger way, along with the US, given our now friendship with the US.
Sunil Mittal, the founder of Bharti Enterprises, speaking to Shireen Bhan about the G20 takeaways, of course, and about how the company remains bullish on the Africa business. Sunil Mittal also spoke about the importance of the African Union getting included in the G20. So we'll continue our conversation here on the G20 Summit, get you many more important bites that we've gathered on the sidelines. We'll move on, and shortly we will be joined by John Schindler, who is the Secretary General of FSB, that is Financial Stability Board, who will be in conversation with my colleague Parikshit Luthra. So let's cut into that conversation.
urgently?
Right. I think if you think about any financial institution, you're going to expect certain things to be in place. You're going to expect them to have a framework for how they govern themselves. You're going to have an expectation that they understand that they have certain risks and they need to manage them in a certain way. And you're also going to have expectations about how transparent about what they are, what they hold, what they do. And up till now, there was a lack of that certainty in the crypto space. So these recommendations are high-level recommendations. If you look at them, they'll probably make a lot of common sense to you and I, and we'd say, why weren't they there in the first place? But this puts them there in place, formally endorsed by the G20. So this is a big step, and it fills the gap in terms of just the basics that were needed for crypto assets.
So if I were to ask you about some of the basics, you've also said in that report that FATF recommendations on money laundering must be implemented with reference to crypto assets and stable coins. There should be penalties, and countries should not shy away from imposing penalties on crypto exchanges and crypto assets in case they do not divulge important information. Could you give us a sense of the importance of some of those recommendations?
Right. Well, just think about, first, you mentioned FATF, and one of the big successes of the Indian G20 presidency was that they didn't bring in just our perspective from the Financial Stability Board. They also brought in the IMF to give a macroeconomic, macro-financial. They brought in the FATF. So this is a comprehensive framework. And the importance of having that is, if you have gaps in any particular piece, whether it's gaps globally or gaps in different jurisdictions, the key players are going to find those gaps. They're going to move and situate themselves where they can take advantage of those gaps. So just having this comprehensive framework, bringing in the FATF, which is an aspect that could have been forgotten, but the G20 presidents have brought them in to bring this comprehensiveness. So we now have some clarity, and it seems to be comprehensive, hopefully.
Right. A lot of countries have even thought about a blanket ban on crypto assets and stable coins. What is your view? Should we have a blanket ban, or we should regulate them and use the innovation to our advantage?
Right. So a couple of thoughts. I mean, the framework that we have outlined does not prevent somebody from banning it. If you look at the risks and you say, in our jurisdiction, what's best would be a ban. That's still within the framework. There are some countries who have tried to ban it, and we've actually seen activity in crypto assets increase after their bans, because you're talking about an instrument here that was created outside of the traditional financial system. It's hard to get at in the traditional ways. So could it work? Possibly. But there are potential benefits here. People have a demand for this. So let's regulate it. Let's put in the comprehensive regulatory framework we have for other parts of the financial system so that people who want to use it can use it in a way that doesn't have repercussions for the financial system.
What are the current risks to financial stability that you see from crypto assets and stable coins across the world currently?
Right. They're a financial instrument. All financial instruments involve risk. The difference is that within the traditional financial system, when things arise like the use of leverage or a lack of transparency, there's regulation and supervision in place. In the crypto system, these don't exist, so that the firms that are operating there, or even if they do exist, they're not obeying necessarily the rules. So the firms can operate there in a way that those risks could spill over. When FTX collapsed last year, we saw some ripples, small ripples to the financial system, because the crypto system wasn't fully integrated. It's not interconnected the way other financial instruments are. If that were to increase and somebody were to collapse, we might see waves. Okay, we don't want to see waves. So we put these regulations in place to keep it under control.
Right, and we also see threats coming in, extortion happening with people demanding payments in cryptocurrency. So that is also something that we are seeing around the world as well. Now, when we speak about the synthesis paper that you've come out with the IMF, your own recommendations which you had submitted to the G20, what would be some of the pillars, if I were to ask you 3 or 4 key pillars of your recommendations that any country's legal framework should stand on, what would those be?
Wow, to pin it down to 3 or 4. I think you're going to have to look at a variety of risks. So when you talk about the IMF and the FSB coming together, you're bringing in very different perspectives. But that's why there's a synthesis paper. So you have to look at the financial stability risks. So these are the risks that if an FTX or somebody collapses, there are ripples and repercussions to the financial system. But you also have to look at your macroeconomy and your monetary policy. If you become a highly cryptoized economy, so crypto assets represent a huge portion of your money supply, your ability to affect monetary policy could be diminished. And then you have to think about some of these other pillars like FATF, which are more financial integrity, market integrity sort of things. So you could think about these different pillars being financial stability, macroeconomics, and monetary policy, and financial integrity. So all of these are brought together in the framework now.
Right. What will be the road ahead now in terms of implementing these recommendations? Are we looking at a time frame? How will you work forward now with all the G20 partners?
So this is really important. You can put all the recommendations out, and if nobody implements them, you've done nothing. FSB members and the G20 have agreed very much that first they have to lead by example. So that's going to be an important part. We should see them putting in place their frameworks, and some countries have already done so, in line with these recommendations. But there's an agreement that this goes beyond the G20. So if the G20 nations implement it, but the rest of the world doesn't, the crypto firms are going to find those locations. So what we're working on now is a plan with the IMF and with the other standard-setting bodies and international organizations to ensure that we use all of our tools. The FSB has regional consultative groups. We have 6 of these around the world. The IMF has a very large reach and other tools. So we're trying to put together a plan to get these recommendations out and implemented, to get the capacity within the different countries